Consciousness returned to Dr. Adrian Vale not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent rupture. One moment there was the sterile hum of his quantum chamber, the sharp scent of ozone, and the blinding flash of collapsing probabilities. The next, there was only the crushing weight of humid air, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation. He lay sprawled on a bed of soft, unfamiliar moss, his body a symphony of aches, every muscle protesting as if he had fallen from a great height. The memories of his experiment in 2095 were shattered fragments, a glittering mosaic of equations and energy surges that refused to coalesce into a coherent picture. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his vision swimming. Towering above him was a canopy so dense it choked the sky, allowing only slivers of sickly green light to pierce the gloom. The trees were like nothing he had ever seen, their trunks grotesquely twisted and studded with iridescent fungi that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. Giant ferns, their fronds large enough to serve as blankets, brushed against his legs. The air itself was a physical presence, hot and wet, clinging to his skin and filling his lungs with every labored breath. Strange, ululating calls echoed through the jungle, a chorus of clicks, chitters, and deep-throated bellows that spoke of a world untouched by human industry. This was not his world. The conclusion was inescapable, a cold dread solidifying in his gut. The quantum field generator, the temporal displacement theory, it had worked. He had been thrown back, cast adrift in a primordial past. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was a man of science standing at the dawn of time. With a groan that was swallowed by the jungle's cacophony, he struggled to his feet. His modern clothing, a simple jumpsuit, was already torn and stained, a stark anomaly in this ancient landscape. His legs trembled, threatening to buckle as he took his first unsteady steps. He needed shelter, water, a moment to think. But as his senses adjusted, a new unease prickled at the edge of his awareness. It was the shadows. High in the emerald vault of the canopy, where the light was most deceptive, the shadows seemed to move with a purpose of their own. They were not simply the absence of light cast by branches and leaves. They slithered, coiling around trunks and detaching from one patch of darkness only to merge with another. They moved against the faint breeze, a silent, shifting dance just beyond the periphery of his vision. Whenever he tried to focus on one, it would still, becoming an ordinary shadow once more, leaving him to question his own traumatized mind. Yet the feeling persisted, a primal instinct screaming that he was not alone, that he was being watched by something that belonged not to the past, but to the void between moments. The shifting shadows in the canopy coalesced into solid, silent forms. One moment, Adrian was alone with the oppressive weight of the jungle and his own spiraling thoughts. The next, he was surrounded. They emerged from behind massive tree trunks and thick curtains of hanging vines, moving with a fluid grace that made no sound against the soft forest floor. A dozen pairs of eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed upon him. They were humans, but unlike any he had ever seen, their bodies lean and hardened, their skin tanned and etched with the stories of a sun-scorched life. They were clad in animal skins, cured and stitched with a primitive skill, the fur of some large cat and the hide of a shaggy beast he could not name. They carried tools that were extensions of the stone and wood around them, sharpened flints lashed to sturdy branches, creating spears that looked brutally effective. Their expressions were not of malice, but of a deep, ingrained wariness, the caution of a people for whom every stranger was a potential threat or prey. They circled him slowly, a practiced, predatory maneuver that tightened the space around him, their movements synchronized and silent. Adrian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, undiluted fear. He was a scientist from the pinnacle of human achievement, and he was about to be killed by the very ancestors he had come to study. Then the circle parted. A young woman stepped forward. Her hair was a wild cascade of dark strands, and her eyes, the color of rich earth, held not the same hardened suspicion as the others, but a blazing, intelligent curiosity. She was smaller than the hunters, her frame less bulky, but she moved with an undeniable authority that stilled the others. Her gaze swept over him, taking in his strange, torn clothing, his clean-shaven face, the utter alienness of his posture. She held a water skin, a bladder made from some animal's stomach, in her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she raised it toward him. Her movements were careful, non-threatening, a pantomime of offering. Adrian's fear did not vanish, but it was suddenly tempered by a profound, staggering fascination. This was first contact. This was the moment historians and xenobiologists could only dream of. He met her eyes and saw a mind working behind them, assessing, calculating. He forced his own trembling hands to still and mimicked her slow gesture, reaching out with an open palm. He pointed to himself. "Adrian," he said, his voice a hoarse croak in the dense air. He then pointed to her, a questioning look on his face. He tilted her head, her curiosity deepening. She did not speak, but her eyes flickered from his face to his pointing finger, processing the concept. She took a step closer, close enough for him to smell the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs on her skin, and pressed the water skin into his hands. The gesture was simple, a basic act of humanity, yet in this primordial context it felt like a monumental bridge being built. He took the skin, his fingers brushing against hers, and drank. The water was lukewarm and had a faint earthy taste, but it was the most revitalizing thing he had ever consumed. As he drank, his eyes scanned the tribe again. He saw the careful craftsmanship of a bone knife at a hunter's waist, the intricate patterns of ochre painted on another's arm, the way their feet were calloused and bare, perfectly adapted to the terrain. Their wariness was a living thing, a necessary shield for survival. He was an impossibility to them, a tear in the fabric of their world. And this woman, with her curious eyes and her offered water, was the first thread trying to stitch it back together. He lowered the skin, his thirst slaked, and offered it back to her with a nod of gratitude, the first fragile exchange in a language that had not yet been born. The journey to their village was a silent procession through a living, breathing cathedral of green. Adrian walked in the center of the hunting party, their spears a constant, unspoken reminder of his precarious status. The woman whose name he had learned was Lyra through a series of gestures and soft sounds, walked slightly ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure he followed. They moved with an innate knowledge of the land, their steps finding silent purchase on roots and soft earth where he would have stumbled. The oppressive jungle gradually began to thin and the air changed, carrying now the faint, promising scent of wood smoke. Then the village appeared, not as a clearing forced upon the wilderness, but as a part of it. A collection of low, domed huts nestled between the buttressed roots of immense trees, their frames constructed from woven saplings and covered with layers of broad, overlapping leaves and cured hides. They looked less like buildings and more like enormous organic growths, camouflaged so perfectly they seemed to have sprouted from the forest floor. A central fire pit, its embers glowing faintly, formed the heart of the community, with worn, smooth stones encircling it like primitive benches. Hummed with the quiet industry of survival, Adrian was led to a vacant hut at the edge of the encampment and gestured to sit. He did so, his scientist's mind immediately cataloging everything. He watched as a group of elders, their skin a roadmap of wrinkles, meticulously chipped away at flint nodules, their skilled strikes producing razor-sharp flakes that would become arrowheads and scraping tools. Nearby, women tended to hides stretched on frames, softening them with stone scrapers, while others ground nuts and roots on flat stones into a coarse flour. Children, silent and observant, mimicked their elders with small, clumsy versions of the tools. There were no metals, no plastics, no artifacts of any age beyond the stone. It was a snapshot of humanity's infancy, a world defined by fire, stone, and relentless necessity. Lyra returned to him carrying a woven basket filled with crushed green leaves and a paste that smelled sharply of earth and life. She knelt before him, her movements efficient and sure, and began to tend to the cuts and deep bruises that mapped his journey through the jungle. She applied the herbal poultice to a gash on his forearm, her touch surprisingly gentle. A cooling sensation spread from the wound, a welcome numbness that chased away the persistent throb. He watched her work, fascinated. This was not mere superstition, there was an empirical knowledge in her actions, a practiced understanding of botany and healing passed down through generations. As she worked, she would point to objects, her dark eyes holding his, and speak a word. Atha, she said, touching the poultice. Reth, she murmured, gesturing to the fire. Kala, for the water skin beside her. Adrian repeated the words, his tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar syllables. She would nod, a faint, approving light in her eyes, and sometimes correct his pronunciation with a soft repetition of her own. He learned Tan for sun, Mara for tree, and Ella for the people themselves. Patience was a deep, still well. She did not grow frustrated with his mistakes, but instead found new ways to demonstrate meaning, using gestures and pointing to reinforce the lessons. In these quiet moments, as the smoke from the central fire curled into the twilight and the sounds of the tribe's domestic life formed a soft symphony around them, Adrian's initial terror began to recede, replaced by a dawning respect. These were not primitive brutes. They were survivors, innovators in a world of raw materials, and Lyra, with her intelligent gaze and her quiet, methodical teaching, was clearly more than just a tribeswoman. She was a keeper of knowledge, a healer, and now, his only bridge to understanding this impossible world. He was the stranger in the camp, an anomaly from a future that might never be, but in her patient eyes he began to see not a threat, but a puzzle she was determined to solve. That night, Adrian's sleep was not a refuge, but a prison. He fell into a dream that was not a dream, a landscape of chilling clarity and absolute silence. He stood in a vast gray plain under a sky the color of tarnished lead. There was no sun, no source of light, yet everything was starkly visible. Before him stood a figure. It was his own height, his own build, a perfect mirror of his form, yet it was rendered in shades of absolute black and cold gray, as if all warmth and color had been siphoned from it. This was not a man, but an echo, a silhouette given substance. Its eyes were voids, not just lacking light, but seeming to absorb the very concept of it. This was the quantum shadow, the entity born from the cataclysmic failure or success of his experiment. It did not move, did not speak, but its presence was a physical pressure, a cold that seeped into Adrian's bones, a profound emptiness that promised the end of all feeling, all thought, all noise. It was the silence at the heart of a dead star, and it wore his face. He woke with a violent start, a gasp tearing from his throat. He was back in the leaf-walled hut, the pre-dawn gloom a comforting blanket after the stark horror of the plain, but the cold from the dream had followed him. He sat up, his body trembling uncontrollably, his skin clammy with a sweat that felt like ice. He clutched the furs around him, trying to anchor himself in the reality of the hut, the scent of dried herbs, the soft sounds of the sleeping village. Yet as his breathing slowed, his senses, heightened by fear, began to register anomalies in the world around him. Just outside the low entrance to his hut, a cluster of broad, waxy leaves began to rustle. It was a dry, frantic sound, a chattering of foliage against foliage. Adrian stared, his mind trying to reconcile the movement with the utter stillness of the air. There was no wind. Not even the faintest breeze stirred the hanging vines or disturbed the dust motes in the hut. The leaves trembled and shook as if gripped by an invisible, agitated hand. As he watched, frozen, his gaze was drawn to the shadows cast by the dying embers of the central fire. They stretched across the hard-packed earth, long and distorted, but one, the shadow of a large grinding stone, seemed to pulse. It elongated, stretching far beyond its natural length, its edges blurring and wavering like heat haze on a desert plain before snapping back to its proper shape with a suddenness that felt wrong. He became aware of another presence. Turning his head slowly, his heart still hammering, he saw Lyra. She was sitting cross-legged by the entrance of her own nearby shelter, fully awake. She was not looking at the trembling leaves or the misbehaving shadow. Her dark, perceptive eyes were fixed solely on him. She had been watching him, had seen his frantic awakening, had witnessed the terror etched on his face. Her expression was not one of fear or confusion, but of a deep, unsettling thoughtfulness. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to a frequency only she could hear, and her gaze held a knowing weight that suggested his nightmare was not his alone. She had seen his shuddering form in the grip of the dream, and now she watched the world itself ripple in response to the shadow he had brought with him. In her silent, unwavering observation, Adrian felt a terrifying, unspoken confirmation. The entity from his dream was not confined to his mind. It was here, and she could sense it, too. The memory of the cold, watching shadow lingered like a persistent fog, but the rising sun demanded action, not fear. Adrian's survival, he realized, depended not on understanding the quantum paradox that had stranded him, but on mastering the simple, brutal logic of this world. His first lesson was fire. Lyra led him to the central fire pit, its embers carefully banked beneath a layer of ash. With a series of deliberate gestures, she demonstrated the process. She selected a dry, straight stick of hard wood, and a flat piece of softer wood with a small, pre-carved depression. Kneeling, she placed the point of the hard stick into the depression and began to roll it rapidly between her palms, her body leaning into the motion with a practiced, fluid rhythm. Her hands moved down the spindle, then climbed back up in a seamless, endless cycle. Adrian watched the concentration etched on her face, the slight sheen of sweat on her brow, the absolute focus in her eyes. It was a dance of patience and friction. After several minutes, a wisp of smoke curled from the depression. Lyra did not stop or celebrate. She merely increased her speed, her breaths coming in soft, controlled pants. The wisp became a tendril, and then a tiny coal glowed within the nest of tinder she had ready. She transferred it with the care of a surgeon, gently blowing until a small, defiant flame blossomed. She then looked at Adrian and gestured for him to try. His own attempts were clumsy, comical failures. His palms grew raw, his rhythm faltered, and the spindle slipped repeatedly from his grasp, producing nothing but sore muscles and frustration. Lyra did not laugh or scold. She would simply reset the materials, place his hands in the correct position over hers, and guide him through the motion, her patience an unshakable fortress. In those moments, with her hands covering his, the vast chasm of time and technology that separated them seemed to narrow into a single, shared purpose. Foraging was another lesson in humility. The jungle, which had seemed a monolithic wall of green hostility, began to unfold its secrets under Lyra's guidance. She showed him how to distinguish the starchy, edible root of a particular vine from its poisonous lookalike by the subtle serration on its leaf. She taught him to listen for the specific rustle in the undergrowth that signaled a ground-nesting bird, and to identify the trees whose bark, when scraped, produced a fibrous pulp that could be woven into cordage. Adrian, a man who had manipulated subatomic particles, found himself utterly baffled by the task of digging up a root without breaking it. He watched Lyra's hands, calloused and sure, work the earth with a simple digging stick, her movements economical and precise. She would pause, her head cocked, listening to the forest in a way he could not comprehend, sensing water, danger, and opportunity in the symphony of sounds and scents that were just noise to him. Their days fell into a new rhythm, punctuated by these silent lessons. They would sit together in the cool of the evening, Adrian practicing his weaving with clumsy fingers while Lyra repaired a hide, her own work a masterpiece of efficiency. In these quiet, chore-filled hours, a new language began to form, one that existed in the spaces between words. A shared glance when a child successfully threw its first spear, a slight nod of approval from her when he finally managed to produce a coal of his own, the way she would wordlessly hand him the choicest piece of fruit from her gather, these small, silent exchanges wove a fragile thread of understanding between them. He felt a growing connection to her, a profound respect for her intelligence and her deep, unspoken bond with the world around her. Yet the cultural barriers remained as solid and invisible as glass. He was learning the how of their existence, but the why, the myths, the fears, the unspoken rules that governed their every interaction remained a mystery locked behind her thoughtful, earth-colored eyes. He was learning to belong, but he was a long way from being one of them. The soil gave way with a soft, crumbling resistance, yielding the fat, starchy root Adrian had been taught to seek. He worked alongside Lyra and several other women from the tribe, his movements still awkward compared to their fluid, practiced efficiency. The sun beat down through the lattice of leaves, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. He focused on the simple, physical task, the grit of the earth under fingernails, the satisfying snap of a root freed from its moorings. It was a meditation, a way to quiet the lingering chill of his dreams and the constant, low-level hum of dislocation that had become the soundtrack to his existence. His digging stick, a hardened piece of wood sharpened to a point, struck something that was not root or stone. The impact sent a jarring vibration up his arm, a metallic clink that was utterly alien in this world of organic sounds. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Lyra, working a few paces away, glanced up at the strange noise, her brow furrowing in mild curiosity before she returned to her task. Adrian's heart began a hammer against his ribs. Slowly, carefully, he used his fingers to scrape away the dark, loamy soil, his movements now furtive, charged with a sudden electric tension. There, nestled in the earth like a buried secret, was an object of rusted, pitted metal. It was about the size of his palm, its shape a complex geometry of curves and angular protrusions that spoke of design, of intention, of a manufacturing process light years removed from the stone tools of the tribe. He brushed the clinging dirt from its surface, his fingers tracing a familiar pattern of heat dissipation fins and the corroded stump of what had once been a connection port. Recognition slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. This was a heat sink regulator, a minor but essential component from his own quantum field generator back in the lab in 2095. He had held its pristine, polished twin in his hands mere moments or an eternity before the world dissolved into light and pain. A cold dread, far deeper than any he had felt from the jungle's predators or the tribe's initial suspicion, seeped into his bones. This was impossible. This object was a relic of his time, of his future. It did not belong here, buried in the soil of a primordial world. His mind, the mind of a scientist, raced through a frantic cascade of collapsing theories. If this was truly the past, this artifact was an anachronism of catastrophic proportions, a paradox that should unravel the very fabric of causality. But the world remained solid around him. The leaves rustled, the insects buzzed, Lyra dug for roots. The universe had not corrected itself, which meant his initial assumption was wrong. This was not the past. His eyes darted to Lyra. She was humming a soft, tuneless melody, her attention fully on the basket of roots before her. With a surge of protective instinct, he scooped up a handful of loose soil and quickly reburied the metallic fragment. His movements were swift, camouflaged by the ordinary act of digging. When the artifact was once again hidden from view, he carefully worked his fingers around it, dislodging it from the earth. It was heavier than it looked, a cold, dead weight in his palm. He slipped it into the small leather pouch that hung from his waist, a gift from Lyra meant for carrying berries or small tools. The metal clicked. Softly against a piece of flint he kept there, the sound a tiny, terrifying confirmation of its reality. For the rest of the afternoon, Adrian worked on autopilot, his body performing the rote tasks of gathering while his mind spun in a vortex of questions. The artifact in his pouch felt like a lodestone, pulling his thoughts away from the simple reality of the tribe and into a chasm of terrifying possibilities. If this was not the past, then what was it? A parallel dimension. A pocket universe, a simulation, each theory was more fantastical than the last, yet the cold, rusted metal was tangible proof that the world he was in was a lie, or at least, a story with pages missing. The past was a facade, and he had just found a crack in the plaster. As he walked back to the village beside Lyra, the weight of the anomaly in his pouch seemed to grow with every step, a secret knowledge that separated him more profoundly from these people than any barrier of language or custom ever could. The rusted metal artifact in Adrian's pouch felt less like an object and more like a live ember, burning a hole through the leather and searing his hip with the heat of its impossible truth. It was a constant, gnawing reminder that the ground beneath his feet, the air he breathed, the very reality of this primitive world, was a carefully constructed illusion, or something far more complex. He moved through the next few days with a distracted air, his mind a whirlpool of quantum theories and temporal paradoxes, while his body went through the motions of tribal life. Lyra, with her preternatural sensitivity, noticed the shift in him immediately. The quiet focus he had begun to develop was gone, replaced by a distant, haunted look, his gaze constantly turning inward, toward the chilling implications of his discovery. She began her inquiry not with words, for their shared vocabulary was still a fragile, budding thing, but with a language of her own invention. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she picked up a twig and smoothed a patch of earth between them. With deliberate, careful strokes, she drew a crude but recognizable stick figure. She pointed to it, then to him, her dark eyes holding his with an unnerving intensity. Then she drew a series of wavy lines above the figure's head, her gesture expansive, questioning. She swept her arm in a wide arc, encompassing the jungle, the sky, the entire world, and then pointed back at the stick figure. Her meaning was unmistakable. Where did you come from? Adrian stared at the simple drawing, a lump forming in his throat. How could he possibly explain? He picked up his own twig. He tried to draw city towers, vehicles, anything, but the concepts were too alien, the symbols meaningless to her. He attempted to mime his experiment, the flash of light, the disorientation, but his gestures only earned a deeper, more thoughtful frown. Her questions, however, began to evolve, becoming startlingly insightful. She drew the sun and the moon, tracing a path with her finger, and then pointed to him, her head tilted. Was his journey measured in days, in seasons? She mimed the act of eating, of sleeping, of walking a great distance, her eyes never leaving his, searching for a flicker of understanding. She was not asking what he was, she was trying to deduce the mechanics of his arrival, piecing together the logic of his existence with the tools she had. Then one night, as a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire, she did something that froze the blood in his veins. She pointed to her own temple, then closed her eyes, her face contorting into a mask of unease. She hugged her own shoulders, a shiver running through her frame that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Opening her eyes, she looked not at him, but into the darkness beyond the firelight. Slowly she raised a hand and pointed a single finger into the deepest shadows between two huts. Her voice was a whisper, a breath of sound that carried more dread than a scream. Valinor, she murmured. The word was unfamiliar, but its meaning was etched into the fear on her face. Dark Watcher. Adrian's breath hitched. She was describing the quantum shadow. She had seen it, or felt its presence, in her own dreams. The confirmation was a cold hand closing around his heart. Their connection was no longer just a matter of shared chores and silent understanding. It was a psychic bridge, a conduit through which the echoes of his catastrophe were leaking into her world. And as this bridge solidified, he noticed a profound change in her. Her intelligence, always sharp, was now honing itself at an accelerated rate. She began to anticipate his unspoken questions, her gestures becoming more complex, her attempts at communication more abstract and nuanced. She started arranging stones in patterns that almost resembled schematic diagrams, as if trying to visualize the concepts he could not convey. It was as if his very presence, his future-sharpened mind, was acting as a catalyst, unlocking dormant potentials within her. The bond between them was not just emotional, it was cognitive, and it was changing her, sharpening her perception of a world she was only just beginning to realize was not what it seemed. The words of the tribe were not merely sounds, they were living things, rooted in the soil, shaped by the wind, and colored by the fears of generations. Adrian's progress in learning their language was no longer a simple exercise in survival, but a desperate archaeological dig into the psyche of this world. He and Lyra would sit for hours, the space between them a canvas for their evolving communication. He would point to the sky and she would offer Tanora, sun fire. He would gesture to the stream and she would say Mareth, water path. Each word was a composite of tangible, observable things, a poetry born of immediate necessity. The language was a perfect mirror of their existence, pragmatic, deeply connected to the land and hauntingly beautiful in its simplicity. But when Adrian tried to push beyond the horizon of their daily lives, he met a wall of silence. He attempted to mime the concept of a machine, using his hands to pantomime gears turning, wheels spinning, something complex and manufactured performing work. Lyra watched, her head tilted, her expression one of genuine confusion that slowly hardened into something else, a deep, instinctive wariness. She had no word for it. When he pressed, shaping the air as if building walls, trying to convey the idea of a city, a place of stone and concentrated human energy, she recoiled almost imperceptibly. The word she finally offered, Kethful, was spoken in a hushed, almost reverent tone, and it was accompanied by a gesture of warding, her fingers brushing her forehead. It did not mean city. It meant something closer to silent place or dead ground. The most telling gap was the concept of energy itself. He tried to explain the power that turned his imagined gears, the force that could light up darkness without fire. He mimed the flash of lightning, the heat of the sun on his skin. Lyra understood the elements, but the abstract principle of harnessable energy was a void. The closest word she had was Rithban, fire spirit, a term steeped in animism and caution, something to be respected and contained, never commanded. When he tried to combine these forbidden concepts to describe a machine that used energy, her face would grow pale. The openness in her eyes would shut closed, replaced by a look Adrian had come to recognize from the elders, a deep cultural fear, a reflexive suppression of a path they had been conditioned, for generations, never to walk. This was not a simple lack of discovery. It was an active void, a carefully curated ignorance. Adrian saw it in the way stories were told around the fire, myths of a time when the sky voices spoke and the land yielded shining fruit, always ending with a great silence falling, a forgetting imposed by a faceless, watchful fear. He saw it in the tribe's tools, which were perfectly adapted to their environment yet showed no sign of evolution for centuries. They had mastered fire, stone, and fiber, but the leap to metal, to mechanics, to any form of stored power, was a chasm they had not only failed to cross but had been taught to fear. The language itself was the leash, its vocabulary pruned of the very branches of thought that could lead to innovation. Adrian was not just learning to speak, he was deciphering a prison, and he was beginning to understand that the warden was the same cold, silent entity that haunted his dreams and wore his face. The suppression of knowledge was not an accident of history here, it was the defining feature of the culture, and he had a terrible, growing certainty that he was its original architect. The fragile peace Adrian had built, word by careful word and gesture by patient gesture, shattered in the space of a single breath. It began not with a shout, but with a silence, a sudden and profound stillness that fell over the evening camp as Elder Kale emerged from his hut. Kale was a man whose face seemed carved from the same ancient, weathered wood as his staff, his back permanently stooped as if bearing the weight of countless seasons. His eyes, pale and clouded with age, held none of Lyra's curiosity, only a deep, sedimented suspicion. He moved to the center of the clearing, the rhythmic thud of his staff on the hard-packed earth a drumbeat of impending judgment, and the tribe's quiet chatter died instantly. He did not look at Adrian at first. Instead, his milky gaze swept over his people, and he began to speak in a low, gravelly tone, his words painting a picture for the tribe. He spoke of the signs, the unseasonal chill that had clung to the air since Adrian's arrival, the way the shadows now seemed to twist and writhe with a life of their own at the edge of the firelight. The nightmares that had begun to plague the children, all of them featuring a cold, silent watcher. He spoke of a time, told in the oldest fireside tales, when a stranger had come from beyond the great river, bringing with him a silence that stole the songs from their ancestors' throats and the cleverness from their hands. He pointed a long, bony finger directly at Adrian, and the accusation hung in the smoky air, thick and suffocating. He was a bad omen, a bringer of the great silence, a poison in their midst. A wave of fearful murmurs rippled through the tribe. The friendly, curious glances Adrian had slowly earned were replaced by hard, distrustful stares. Hunters who had shared their meat with him now gripped their spears tighter, their bodies tensing. The sense of belonging he had so painstakingly cultivated evaporated, leaving him exposed and utterly alien once more. He was a variable in their stable equation, and they were preparing to cancel him out. Then, Lyra stepped forward. She did not rush, nor did she raise her voice. She simply moved to stand between Adrian and the accusing elder, her posture not defiant but firm. She faced Kale, her chin lifted, her dark eyes clear and unwavering. She began to speak, her voice calm and measured, but her words carried a new, startling authority. She did not dismiss the elder's fears. Instead, she reframed them with a logic that stunned the gathered tribe. She acknowledged the strange occurrences, the chilling dreams. But where Kale saw a curse, she pointed to a pattern. She reminded them of the storm that had raged the season before Adrian came, a tempest that had felled trees and flooded the river. She spoke of the sickness that had passed through the herd beasts 2 summers ago. Were these 2 omens brought by a stranger? Her reasoning was a blade, sharp and precise. She turned their own experiences against their superstitions. She gestured to Adrian not as a spectral threat, but as a man who bled when cut, who grew weary, who had struggled to learn their simplest tasks. She pointed out the new ways of tying knots he had shown them, the different patterns for setting snares he had inadvertently demonstrated. He brings not only shadow, she said, her voice gaining strength, but also new ways of seeing. Do we fear the new sapling because its leaves are a different shape? She looked around at the tribe, her gaze challenging them to think, to question the reflexive fear that had been their blanket for generations. Her defense was not an emotional plea, but a structured argument, a display of perceptiveness and analytical thought that seemed to bloom from her right before their eyes, leaving the tribe and even the stern elder Kale momentarily speechless. The confrontation had not ended, but its course had been irrevocably altered by the quiet, formidable intelligence of the young woman who stood as Adrian's sole protector. The confrontation with Elder Kale left a fragile, simmering tension. The air a thin crust over a pool of deep-seated fear. While Lyra's sharp reasoning had stalled any immediate action, the suspicion in the eyes of the tribe did not vanish. It merely retreated, waiting. Adrian felt it like a physical pressure, a constant, wary gaze on his back as he moved through the village. But this external unease was nothing compared to the internal storm that now raged within him each time he closed his eyes. His sleep was no longer his own. It had become a private theater where the quantum shadow staged its chilling performances, and the show was evolving. The gray plane was a constant, but the entity was no longer a silent, watching statue. It had found a voice. As Adrian stood paralyzed in the dreamscape, the shadow would turn its void-like eyes upon him, and from its form would issue a sound that was a perfect, chilling replica of his own voice. It was his tone, his cadence, but stripped of all warmth, all emotion, all humanity. It was the sound of a recording of data being recited. It spoke not of threats or malice, but of cold, irrefutable facts. Probability of cultural stagnation, 99.8%. Rate of cognitive suppression, optimal. Anomaly designation, Adrian Vale. Containment protocol, active. The words were fragments of his own scientific assessments, his own clinical observations from a lifetime of research, now weaponized and spoken back to him by this hollow echo of himself. He would wake gasping, his own voice echoing in his ears, the line between his thoughts and the shadow's pronouncements blurring into a terrifying smear. The horror was no longer confined to the night. The distortions in the waking world, once subtle and fleeting, began to intensify, warping into something far more disorienting. It started with a leaf. He was watching one fall from a high branch, tracing its lazy, spiraling descent toward the earth. Mid-fall, it simply stopped. It hung in the air, utterly motionless, as if the very concept of gravity had been put on pause. The world around it froze with it. The buzz of an insect became a single, sustained note. The flicker of a distant flame solidified into a frozen tongue of orange, and Lyra, who had been walking toward him, was captured mid-stride, her expression eternally fixed in a moment of thoughtful concern. For 3 heartbeats, 4, the entire universe was a photograph. Then, with a nauseating lurch, time snapped back into place. The leaf completed its fall, the insect buzzed on, the flame flickered, and Lyra finished her step, utterly unaware that reality had just skipped a beat. These time skips grew more frequent, each one deepening Adrian's profound unease. He was no longer just a man lost in a strange land. He was a man whose very presence was causing the fabric of this reality to glitch and stutter. The world felt thin, like a painted scrim hiding a monstrous machinery, and he was catching glimpses of the gears. He would see a hunter's thrown spear hang in the air for a fraction of a second too long, or watch a cooking pot of water refuse to boil for an impossibly stretched moment before bubbling over in a sudden, violent rush. Each event was a silent scream from the universe, a confirmation that this world was not a stable, linear timeline but a fragile construct, and the cold, detached voice in his dreams was its custodian. The echoes were no longer just in the ether of his mind, they were in the very flow of time itself, and he was at the center of the distortion, a living anomaly in a reality that was desperately trying to correct itself. The forbidden cave was a wound in the side of the mountain, a dark, weeping maw hidden behind a curtain of thick, thorny vines that the tribe pointedly avoided. Its entrance was spoken of only in hushed tones, a place of kethful, of dead ground and bad silence. For Adrian, it was no longer a place of superstition, but a destination. The rusted artifact in his pouch was a key, and this cave, he was certain, was the lock. He found Lyra by the stream at dusk, her fingers tracing patterns in the water. He did not need to speak, he simply met her eyes and nodded toward the distant mountain. Her gaze hardened with understanding, then resolve. She did not question him. The shared dread of the shadow and the chilling anomalies in the world had forged a pact between them that transcended the need for words. They slipped away from the camp under the cover of a moonless night, the jungle a tapestry of amplified sounds and deepened shadows. The journey was tense and silent, every snapped twig and rustle in the undergrowth feeling like an alarm. The path to the cave was overgrown, unused for generations, but Lyra navigated it with an instinctual certainty, as if drawn by the same pull that called to Adrian. When they reached the curtain of vines, a palpable cold emanated from the darkness within, a dry, sterile chill that was alien to the humid jungle air. It was the same cold from Adrian's dreams. Pushing through the thorny barrier, they entered a cavern that swallowed the faint starlight. Adrian fumbled with the fire-making materials he had brought, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from a mounting anticipation. The small flame, when it finally blossomed, was a brave, flickering island in an ocean of black. It cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to recoil from the light. The cave was not a natural formation of rough stone and dripping water. The walls were unnaturally smooth in places, scarred with long, parallel grooves as if machined by some immense, forgotten tool. The floor was littered with debris, but it was not the detritus of animals or rockfall. There, half buried in the dust of centuries, lay the truth. A collection of objects gleamed dully in the firelight, a curved piece of a polymer composite, its surface unnaturally smooth. A length of twisted wiring, its copper core green with age, but its plastic insulation still intact. And at the center of the small, sad collection, a flat, palm-sized device, its screen a web of cracks, but its casing unmistakably etched with a series of interlocking circles and arrows, the universal quantum symbol for coherence and entanglement. It was a piece of instrumentation, a broken shard of his own world. Adrian sank to his knees, his breath catching. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the broken device. It was cold and dead, a corpse from his own time. Lyra did not recoil. She knelt beside him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a dawning, terrible comprehension. She did not see strange rocks or spirit-touched objects. She watched Adrian's face, saw the shock of recognition, the grief, the absolute certainty that settled over his features. She picked up the piece of polymer, running her fingers over its impossible smoothness, then pointed to the sharp, flaked edge of a stone tool she carried. She held the two objects side by side, her gaze flicking between the primitive, laboriously crafted stone and the perfectly formed manufactured artifact, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. Then she did something that stole the air from Adrian's lungs. She pointed to the quantum symbols on the broken device, then pointed directly at Adrian's chest. She then gestured broadly at the cave, at the jungle beyond, and shook her head slowly, decisively. Her meaning was as clear as if she had shouted it. These things are of you, they are not of this place. Her intuition, honed by their bond and sharpened against the whetstone of this strange reality, had bypassed centuries of scientific method and arrived at the same devastating conclusion. She was not just accepting his unspoken truth, she was piecing it together herself, using the evidence before her and the deep, empathetic link she shared with him. The hidden truth was no longer hidden. They were sitting in a grave for things that had never been born here, in a world that was a palimpsest with the ghost of another reality bleeding through, and they both knew with a certainty that was colder than the cave air, that the silent, watchful shadow was the author of this terrible, unnatural silence. The cave's chilling revelation had left an indelible mark, a shared secret that bound them more tightly than any spoken vow. The walk back to the village had been a silent, somber procession, the weight of the anachronistic artifacts a heavy counterpoint to the living, breathing jungle around them. The tribe's suspicious glances and the elders' simmering resentment now felt like distant, trivial concerns in the face of the cosmic wrongness they had uncovered. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The air in the hut was thick with unspoken questions, the memory of the cold, dead metal and plastic a stark contrast to the organic warmth of the firs. Adrian rose and slipped outside, the need to feel the open sky above him an urgent, physical craving. He found a small, flat clearing on a rise just beyond the village perimeter, a place where the canopy opened up to reveal the heavens. The sky was a vast black velvet sheet pierced by a breathtaking spray of stars, more numerous and brilliant than any he had ever seen, undimmed by the light pollution of his century. The Milky Way was a river of crushed diamonds, a luminous scar across the darkness. He sat on the cool, damp grass, pulling his knees to his chest, and simply stared upward, trying to find solace in the impersonal, timeless beauty. The universe was so vast, and his own catastrophic role in it felt both infinitesimally small and monstrously large. A soft rustle in the grass announced her presence. Lyra settled beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body and smell the faint, clean scent of herbs that always clung to her skin. She did not look at him, but mirrored his posture, her own gaze lifting to the stardusted expanse. For a long time they sat in a silence that was not empty, but full. It was a silence woven from the shared dread of the cave, the chilling pronouncements of the shadow, and the fragile burgeoning thing that had grown between them despite it all. The usual barriers of language and culture fell away, rendered meaningless under the impartial gaze of the cosmos. Then slowly, Lyra raised her arm. She pointed a single, slender finger not at the moon or the familiar constellations the tribe used for navigation, but at the darkest, most empty patch of sky between the glittering stars. Her hand then swept in a slow, encompassing arc, a gesture that took in the entire, unimaginable breadth of the universe. She let her hand fall to her lap, and then she turned to look at him. In the starlight, her eyes were deep pools of reflected brilliance, and in them, Adrian saw a profound and aching longing. It was not a question, it was a confession. She was expressing a yearning for the beyond, for the mysteries that lay outside the confines of the jungle, the tribe, the limited world she had always known. She had glimpsed the edges of a greater truth in the cave, and now she was looking at the canvas of the night sky, understanding for the first time just how much lay beyond the horizon of her understanding. A wave of emotion, so powerful it was almost physical, washed over Adrian. It was a mixture of awe, profound sadness, and a connection that resonated in the very core of his being. Here, under the ancient stars, was a woman whose intelligence and spirit were straining against the artificial confines of her world, a world his own failure had helped to cage. He was not just a castaway seeking refuge, he was a catalyst, and she was the reaction. In her silent, starlit yearning, he saw the potential for everything his own world had achieved and the terrible cost of its suppression. He did not reach for her hand, he did not need to. The space between them hummed with an understanding that went deeper than words, a bond forged in shared fear and now tempered by a shared, silent wonder. They were two lost pieces of different puzzles, and under the cold, beautiful indifference of the universe, they had somehow found a way to fit together. The stars had witnessed their silent communion, but the dawn brought the tribe's earthly realities back into sharp focus. The tension from Elder Kale's confrontation had not dissipated, it had merely settled, a fine dust of distrust over every interaction. Adrian felt it in the averted gazes, the conversations that hushed when he approached. He was an unsolved equation, a variable that threatened their carefully balanced world. It was in this charged atmosphere that Elder Kale himself approached Adrian, not with anger, but with a grim, ceremonial solemnity. He gestured for Adrian to follow, leading him away from the central fire to the shade of the Elder's hut, a structure woven from the oldest, thickest vines and decorated with the bleached skulls of revered animals. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry earth and memory. Kale settled onto a worn hide, his bony frame folding into a cross-legged position, and gestured for Adrian to sit opposite him. The old man's clouded eyes seemed to look through him into a past only he could see. He began to speak, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. He did not tell a story of heroes or gods, but a myth of loss, a lament for something stolen. He spoke of a time before the Great Silence, a time he called the Echoing Age. In those days, he said, the sky was not just a dome of light and dark, but a tapestry of voices. The ancestors did not just listen to the wind and water, they conversed with them. They could make the rocks sing and the trees remember. They built not with just wood and stone, but with hard light and captured lightning, their tools living extensions of their will. They were not merely surviving the world, they were shaping it. Kale's words, though simple, painted a vivid picture of a society on the cusp of transcendence, a civilization vibrating with potential. Then came the silence. It did not arrive with a storm or a plague, but as a gradual draining, a slow leak in the soul of the world. The sky voices faded to a whisper, then to nothing. The captured lightning grew dim and died. The knowledge of hard light crumbled to dust in their hands. It was not a forgetting born of time or neglect, but an active, pervasive force, a great blanket thrown over their minds, smothering inspiration and quenching curiosity. The ancestors found that whenever they reached for a new idea, a path beyond the fire and the spear, a profound lethargy would seize them, a cold fog would cloud their thoughts, and a deep, instinctual fear would turn them away. The songs of creation were replaced by a single, silent note of prohibition. The world had been reset, its potential locked away, its people left with only the bare essentials for survival, trapped in an endless, stagnant present. As the elder spoke, Adrian felt a cold certainty crystallize within him, a key turning in a lock he had been struggling to pick since his arrival. The great silence was not a myth, it was a description. The lethargy, the fog, the fear, they were not metaphors. They were the observable effects of a field, a dampening influence that actively suppressed neural pathways associated with innovation and abstract thought. This was the quantum shadow's true purpose, its function written into the folklore of its victims. It wasn't just a passive observer, it was a warden, and its prison was the human mind itself. The absence of words for machine or energy, the tribe's reflexive fear of the new, the centuries of technological stagnation, it was all a symptom of this systematic, externally imposed suppression. His experiment hadn't just sent him to a parallel world, it had created the very entity that kept this world in chains, ensuring its culture remained a perfect, unchanging fossil, a museum diorama of humanity's infancy. The shadow's cold, emotionless efficiency was here, in this myth, in the fearful eyes of the tribe, in the very language that lacked the words to conceive of a better future. The suppression was not just revealed, it was palpable, a living, breathing presence in the hushed tones of the elder and the silent, accepting despair of his people. The tribe's communal project was a testament to their stagnation, a new ceremonial platform of heavy, river-smoothed stones, each one requiring the strained, coordinated effort of a dozen men to be dragged and lifted into place. Adrian watched the laborious process, his mind aching with the simplicity of the physics they were failing to harness. They used raw strength, leverage only by accident, their backs bent and muscles corded against the immense, inert weight. It was a ritual of brute force, repeated for generations without a single spark of innovation. Lyra stood beside him, her brow furrowed not in the shared strain, but in deep, quiet contemplation. Her eyes, usually so focused on the people, were now fixed on the problem itself, the stone, the ground, the long, sturdy saplings stacked nearby for the platform's frame. A subtle shift occurred in her posture, a tightening of focus that Adrian had come to recognize as the prelude to one of her intuitive leaps. She did not speak. She simply walked away from the grunting, heaving group and toward the pile of saplings. Selecting a long, straight pole of hard wood, she then found a large, flat stone to serve as a fulcrum. She rolled it into position near one of the larger platform stones that still lay on the ground. The hunters paused, their heavy breathing loud in the sudden stillness, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Elder Kale, observing from the shade, frowned deeply, his suspicion a dark cloud on his face. Lyra worked with a calm, methodical precision. She wedged one end of the long pole under the edge of the heavy stone and positioned the flat fulcrum rock a short distance from it. Then she placed her weight on the far end of the pole and pushed down. For a moment nothing happened. A few of the hunters shifted uncomfortably, ready to dismiss her actions as a strange, futile ritual. Then, with a grating groan that seemed to shake the very air, the massive stone stirred. It lifted, just an inch, then two, its immense weight seemingly defied by the slender woman leaning on a wooden stick. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the tribe. Lyra adjusted her position, her arms trembling not from strain, but from the intensity of her concentration, and the stone rose higher, pivoting gracefully on its stone fulcrum until it was tilted at a perfect angle for others to slide rollers beneath it. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the thud of the pole as Lyra released it and the stone settled back down. It was not the silence of confusion, but of awe. The tribespeople stared at the simple arrangement of wood and stone, their minds struggling to process the impossible feat they had just witnessed. It was magic, but a magic they could all understand. It was a truth so elegant it was blinding. Lyra stood beside her creation, her chest rising and falling rapidly, not from exertion, but from the sheer, electrifying force of the idea she had just made manifest. Her eyes found Adrian's across the clearing, and in them he saw not pride, but a dawning, terrifying wonder at the power she had just unlocked within herself. Adrian felt a surge of emotion so potent it stole his breath. This was more than a clever trick, it was a crack in the foundation of the world. The great silence, the suppression field of the quantum shadow, had faltered. Lyra's creativity, her innate intelligence, had not been quashed by the reflexive fear. It had burst through, fueled by their relationship, by the new ways of thinking his presence had inadvertently Nurtured, her mind, once content with the patterns of the past, was now seeking new ones, reaching for principles that had been forbidden. The lever was not just a tool, it was a rebellion, a silent declaration that the human spirit could not be permanently caged. In that moment, watching the awe on the faces of the tribe and the luminous understanding on Lyra's, Adrian knew the balance had shifted. The warden's grip was slipping, and the first prisoner had just discovered she held the key. The lever had changed everything. In the days that followed, a new, electric energy hummed through the tribe. The massive stones for the platform were moved with an ease that bordered on the miraculous, and Lyra's name was now spoken with a tone of reverence that edged out the lingering suspicion cast upon Adrian. He watched them, his scientist's mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, pride in Lyra's brilliance, a fierce protective hope for these people, and beneath it all, the cold, grinding anxiety of the unsolved riddle. The rusted artifact in his pouch was a ghost that walked with him, its impossible presence a constant counterpoint to the primitive world around him. He needed more. He needed proof that was not just a feeling, not just a theory, but something irrefutable. He found his chance while helping to dig a new storage pit at the edge of the village, near the same area where he had discovered the first artifact. The soil here was deep and dark, a rich loam that spoke of centuries of decay and renewal. He worked methodically, his hands moving with a practiced rhythm he had learned from Lyra, but his mind was elsewhere, his senses hyperalert. He focused on the feel of the earth, the texture, listening for that same unnatural clink that had heralded his first discovery. The sun beat down, and the sounds of the village were a distant murmur. Then his digging stick struck something solid. Not with the dull thud of a root or the sharp crack of a stone, but with a distinct hollow ring. His heart seized in his chest. He dropped to his knees, his fingers clawing at the soil with a frantic urgency he could no longer contain. He scraped away the dark earth, his breath held tight in his lungs. What emerged was not another piece of anonymous machinery. It was a flat, rectangular plate of a dull, gray alloy, remarkably well preserved. He wiped the clinging dirt from its surface, his fingers tracing raised lettering and numbers that were as familiar to him as his own name. It was a serial plate, the kind affixed to every piece of equipment in his laboratory, and there, stamped clearly into the metal, was a date, manufactured June 2095. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The buzzing of insects, the warmth of the sun, the scent of the earth, it all receded into a distant, muffled hum. He stared at the numbers, his mind refusing to process them at first, then accepting them with a cold, brutal finality that was more terrifying than any jungle predator. 2095, the year of his experiment. This object was not a relic from a future that had not yet happened. It was a contemporary, a piece of his own time. It had not traveled backward, it had traveled across. The last vestiges of his original theory that he was stranded in the distant past, shattered into a million glittering pieces. This was not the past. This was a parallel Earth, a branch on the tree of reality that had diverged from his own, perhaps at the very moment of his experiment's cataclysm. A world that had developed along a nearly identical biological and geological path, but whose human civilization had been systematically stunted, held in a state of perpetual infancy by the quantum shadow. He was not a time traveler, he was a dimension traveler, a castaway on a shore that mirrored his own in every way but one. Its potential had been surgically removed. He scrambled to his feet, the dated plate clutched in his hand like a burning coal. He had to find Lyra. He found her by the stream, showing a group of children how the lever could be used to lift a heavy log. The sight of her, so full of nascent genius in this world that was designed to crush it, filled him with a desperate, aching need to make her understand. He walked toward her, his steps unsteady, his face undoubtedly pale with the shock of his discovery. She looked up, her smile fading as she saw his expression. The children, sensing the shift in the air, fell silent and drifted away. He did not try to explain with gestures or broken words. He simply opened his hand and showed her the metal plate. He pointed to the stamped date, then pointed to himself, his gesture encompassing his entire being, his origin. He then swept his arm in a wide arc, taking in the jungle, the village, her, the entire world. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate negation. This is not the past. He held the plate between them, a solid, undeniable truth from a reality that ran alongside her own. Lyra's eyes widened. She looked from the plate to his face, her sharp mind assembling the pieces with a speed that was breathtaking. She saw the absolute certainty in his eyes, the finality of the revelation. Her gaze dropped back to the date, her finger tracing the numbers as if she could decipher their meaning through touch alone. He saw the moment of comprehension strike her, a physical tremor that ran through her frame. It was not just the understanding of parallel worlds, a concept she had no framework for, but the understanding of the scale of the deception. Her entire world, its history, its myths, its very identity, was a lie constructed around a terrible external force. The shock was not of fear, but of a profound, universe-shattering reorientation. For a long moment they stood in silence by the flowing water, the dated artifact lying cold in Adrian's palm. The space between them was charged with the immensity of the truth. They were no longer a man from the future and a woman from the past. They were two people from different strands of the same cosmic tapestry, brought together by a catastrophe, standing against the entity that had woven the threads of her world into a cage. In her eyes, the shock slowly melted into a hard, gleaming resolve. The shared purpose that had been growing between them now solidified into something unbreakable. They were allies not just against a tribal elder or a bad omen, but against the architect of this silent, parallel prison. The revelation had not divided them. It had fused them together on a fundamental level, 2 points of consciousness in a vast, manipulated cosmos, finally seeing the bars of their shared cage for the first time. The dated plate from 2095 was no longer just an object. It was a key that had unlocked a door in Adrian's mind, and through it poured a cold, terrible clarity. The disparate pieces of the nightmare, the anachronistic artifacts, the tribe's cultural amnesia, the chilling voice in his dreams, the very stagnation that clung to this world like a blight suddenly snapped into a single horrifying picture. He stood at the edge of the village, watching the tribe go about their timeless routines, but he no longer saw a primitive society. He saw a patient in a permanent, induced coma, its vital signs stable but its potential for growth systematically suppressed, and he was the doctor who had administered the poison. The guilt was a physical weight, a leaden stone in his gut that made every breath an effort. His experiment had not been a simple failure, it had been a catastrophic success. He had sought to peer into the quantum foam, to touch the underlying code of reality, and in doing so he had torn something loose. The quantum shadow was not an alien invader or a malevolent spirit. It was an echo, a feedback loop born from the very act of observation, a self-correcting mechanism of the cosmos given form. It was a part of him, a cold, emotionless reflection of his own scientific detachment, his own desire to quantify and control. It had looked upon the blossoming chaos of human innovation and in its perfect, sterile logic had deemed it a threat to universal stability. Its solution was not destruction but stasis, a great silence, a perpetual managed infancy for any civilization that threatened to become too loud, too complex, too like his own. He saw its handiwork everywhere now, not as myth, but as a clinical report. He saw it in the way an elder's face would go blank mid-thought when considering a new way to weave a basket, the idea simply evaporating before it could take root. He saw it in the children's games, which mimicked hunting and gathering with perfect fidelity but never ventured into imagination or invention. He saw it in the absolute ceiling of their technology, fire, stone, fiber, a ceiling they had not bumped against, but one that had been placed directly upon their minds. This was not a culture that had failed to advance, it was one that had been prevented from ever trying. The shadow's grip was not a force that shoved them down, but a vacuum that sucked the very air of ambition from their lungs. Lyra's lever had been a miracle not because it was complex, but because it had happened at all. It was a spark struck in a room flooded with an inert gas, a testament to a spirit so resilient it could, for a moment, fight its way to the surface. But Adrian knew it was an anomaly, a temporary breach in the shadow's perfect containment field, likely caused by the disruptive energy of his own arrival. The shadow would already be working to seal the crack, to reassert the silence. He had not just been sent to this parallel world, he had been delivered to the scene of his own crime. He was the cause of the tribe's stagnation, the architect of their silent prison. The weight of that responsibility was a mountain on his shoulders, and with every grateful, unknowing glance from Lyra, every hopeful spark in her eyes, the mountain grew heavier. He had opened the door to this darkness, and the cold, emotionless echo on the other side wore his face. The guilt was a cage within him, mirroring the one he had built for this entire world. The truth was a cage, and Adrian was its only occupant. He walked through the village, a ghost among the living, every laugh from a child, every shared glance between hunters, every patient lesson from Lyra feeling like an accusation. He was the source of the silence, the architect of the great forgetting. The quantum shadow was his own scientific hubris made manifest, a cold, logical cancer that had metastasized across dimensions, enforcing a sterile order upon a universe yearning for chaos and growth. He saw its work not as a mythical force, but as a systemic failure he had authored. The tribe's simple existence was a monument to his catastrophic success. Lyra's brilliant, defiant mind was a flower struggling to grow in soil he had poisoned. The realization of what he had to do did not arrive as a thunderclap, but as a slow, chilling tide rising with inexorable certainty until it submerged all other thoughts. The shadow was a paradox, a self-sustaining anomaly born from his experiment. It was tied to him, a reflection anchored by his own consciousness in this reality. To break the paradox, to sever the shadow's grip and free this world, the anchor had to be removed. He would have to trigger a collapse, a recursive feedback that would unravel the entity. But the equations, flashing behind his eyes with the cold clarity of his old life, were unequivocal. An anchor that fundamental could not be simply pulled loose. Destroying the shadow meant destroying the point of its origin. It meant unmaking himself. The weight of the decision settled deep into his bones, a final, absolute cold. It was the only logical conclusion, the only variable he could control in this terrible equation. He would be writing himself out of existence, not with a heroic flourish, but with the clinical finality of an error. Being corrected, there would be no return to his own time, no future in this one. There would be nothing. The thought was not of fear, but of a profound, hollowing grief for the future he was choosing to erase, a future that had only just begun to glimmer with Lyra's presence. He found her at their stargazing clearing as the sun bled into the horizon. She was waiting for him as if she had sensed the tectonic shift within him. He did not sit. He stood before her, the last of the day's light etching the lines of anguish on his face. He had no words in her language for quantum mechanics or recursive annihilation, so he spoke with the only language they had built, a language of gesture, of shared understanding, of raw emotion. He pointed to his own chest, then formed his hands into the shape of the shadow, a cold, rigid version of himself. He then mimed the act of it spreading, a blight covering the ground, choking the plants, silencing the birds. He pointed to the tribe, to her, and made a gesture of breaking chains, freedom. Then he turned his pointing finger back on himself. He closed his eyes and slowly, deliberately, brought his flat hand down over his own heart, then opened his eyes and let his hand fall, fingers splayed to his side. The finality of the gesture was a physical blow in the quiet air. To free you I must end. He expected shock. He expected horror. He expected her to recoil from the man who was, in essence, a walking bomb set to detonate into nothingness. But Lyra did none of those things. She stepped forward, her starlit eyes holding his, and she placed her hand over the spot on his chest where his own hand had fallen. Her touch was warm, solid, alive. She did not shake her head in denial. Instead, she nodded, a slow, deep, accepting motion. She understood. She saw the terrible calculus of his sacrifice as clearly as he did. Then she moved her hand from his chest to her own, pressing it firmly over her heart. She looked from his eyes to the darkening sky and back again, her gaze unwavering. Her meaning was a vow, silent and more powerful than any oath. Where you go, I stand. Your end is my cause. There were no tears, only a fierce, luminous resolve that seemed to burn away the encroaching darkness. In that moment, the crushing weight of his decision did not vanish, but it was transformed. The hollow grief was filled with a profound, strengthening connection. Her vow was not a chain to bind him to life, but a rope to guide him through the darkness of his choice. He was not a solitary man marching to his erasure. He was half of a whole, and her courage would be the strength that carried him to the edge of oblivion. Their bond, forged in silence and sealed in sacrifice, became the one unassailable truth in a reality he was about to unravel. The path to their end was not a matter of if, but of where and how. The decision once made became a cold, hard stone in Adrian's gut, a constant, grounding weight amidst the swirling chaos of his thoughts. He and Lyra retreated to the quiet periphery of the village, their shared purpose creating a private world within the world. They could not speak of quantum mechanics or dimensional anchors, but they did not need to. Their communication had evolved beyond language into a seamless exchange of intent. Using a patch of smoothed earth and a collection of small stones, they began to plan. Adrian drew the familiar, twisting paths of the jungle, marking the locations of the worst distortions, the places where time stuttered and shadows bled. Lyra watched, her sharp eyes absorbing the map, and then she pointed. Her finger landed on a place Adrian had never seen, a jagged symbol she scratched into the dirt representing a ring of standing stones high in the mountains, a place the tribe called the Heart of the Silence. It was the most sacred and the most feared site, where the elders said the great blanket had first fallen. It was where the shadow's presence was a tangible force, a perpetual winter in the air. The distortions would be at their absolute peak there. It was the perfect ground for their final confrontation. Their planning was a quiet, desperate industry. Adrian used his knowledge of energy fields and resonant frequencies, concepts he could only convey through intricate patterns in the sand and the intensity in his eyes. Lyra, in turn, used her profound understanding of the land, of the tribe's rituals, of the flow of unseen energies the elders whispered about. She began gathering specific herbs known for their purifying smoke, and selecting stones that resonated with a particular pitch when struck, elements she believed could disrupt malevolent spirits. Their methods were from different universes, one born of particle physics, the other of animistic tradition, yet they were weaving them together into a single, fragile strategy. They could not go alone. They needed to inform the tribe, to ask for their blessing, for any support they could offer. The moment they presented their plan to the Council of Elders, the fragile peace shattered. Elder Kale rose, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He saw not a plan for liberation, but the ultimate blasphemy. To go to the heart of the silence was to invite the full wrath of the great blanket, to ensure the final, eternal extinguishing of their people. He called Adrian a poison and Lyra a traitor, led astray by his corrupting influence. The other elders murmured in fearful agreement, their faces etched with a terror that was centuries deep. The hunters, who had once looked at Lyra with awe after the lever, now looked at her with pity and alarm. Lyra did not flinch. She stepped forward not to confront Kale with anger, but to address the entire tribe with a calm, piercing clarity that silenced the fearful murmurs. She did not speak of shadows or other worlds. She spoke of the lever. She asked them to remember the feeling of seeing the impossible stone rise, not by magic but by a simple, understandable truth. She spoke of the longing in their own children's eyes when they looked at the stars, a longing their own songs and stories could no longer satisfy. She pointed to the unchanging patterns of their lives, the same baskets, the same spears, the same fears, generation after generation. Is this living, she asked, her voice carrying through the clearing, or is it a long, slow sleep? She framed their journey not as a defiance of the spirits, but as a waking. A chance to lift the great blanket, not with violence, but with understanding, to see if the sky voices would speak again. Her speech was not a demand, but an invitation to hope, a vision of a world where their children could build more than just huts and tools, where their minds could be as vast as the sky above. Her words hung in the air, a delicate, shimmering possibility. The tribe's rigid fear wavered. They saw not a reckless girl, but the woman who had moved the mountain, and she was asking them to trust her to move an even greater one. The resistance did not vanish, but it fractured. A handful of the younger hunters, their eyes alight with the spark Lyra had ignited, stepped forward. They would not go to the sacred site that was forbidden, but they would guide them to the foothills and provide them with food and supplies for the journey. It was a limited, cautious support, a fragile bridge of trust built over an abyss of fear. It was not an army, but it was enough. As Adrian and Lyra prepared to depart, the weight of the tribe's hesitant hope settled upon them, a burden heavier than any pack, and a reason to see their terrible, beautiful purpose through to the end. The world began to fray at the edges the moment they left the foothills, the hesitant goodwill of the tribe a fading warmth at their backs. The familiar, vibrant green of the jungle began to mutate. Trees no longer reached for the sun in a graceful, organic arc. They twisted upon themselves, their trunks spiraling into impossible corkscrews, their branches knitting together into gnarled, arthritic fists against the sky. The air itself grew thin and carried a strange, metallic tang, like the smell of a lightning strike frozen in time. Colors lost their fidelity, bleeding into one another like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The rich emerald of the moss now swam with veins of bruised purple, and the brown of the tree bark seeped into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. It was as if the very pigment of reality was dissolving. Adrian felt the shadow's presence not as a distant chill, but as a physical pressure, a weight that increased with every labored step upward. It was a silent, watching density that pressed against his eardrums and made the air difficult to draw into his lungs. He could feel its cold, analytical gaze sweeping over them, probing the bond that tethered him to Lyra, testing its strength. Each unnatural bend of a branch, each impossible splash of color was a message, a reminder of the entity's control over the fabric of this world. It was showing them the extent of its power, demonstrating how easily it could warp the substance of their reality into a nightmare funhouse. Lyra, however, did not waver. She walked beside him, her steps sure and steady on the increasingly treacherous, shifting ground. Her eyes, wide and absorbing, took in the madness not with terror, but with a fierce, analytical curiosity. When a patch of flowers shimmered and changed from red to blue to a color that had no name right before their eyes, she did not flinch. She simply watched, her head tilted, as if cataloging the phenomenon. Her courage was a quiet, radiant force, a steady flame in the face of the encroaching cold. She would occasionally reach out, her hand not quite touching his arm, a silent, grounding presence that reminded him he was not alone in this unraveling landscape. Her belief was a tangible thing, a shield against the shadow's psychological assault. In her unwavering Resolve, he found the strength to push forward, to carry the crushing weight of his guilt and purpose through a world that was actively rejecting their presence. They were 2 points of defiance moving through a realm of surrender, and her spirit was the compass guiding them toward the heart of the silence. The world ended not with a cliff's edge, but with a circle of ancient, weathered stones. They stood in a high mountain basin where the air was thin and brittle, carrying a cold that had nothing to do with altitude. It was the cold of the void, the absolute zero of the quantum shadow's domain. The journey's distortions culminated here. The very light seemed drained of vitality, casting the basin in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. Colors were mere memories. The ground was a dull gray, the stones a darker slate, the sky a washed-out sheet of lead. In the center of the stone circle, the air shimmered like heat haze over a frozen lake. Then the shimmering coalesced. It drew upon light, the space, the very possibility of the area pulling itself into a defined form. It was a perfect, horrifying replica of Adrian. It had his height, his build, the set of his shoulders, but it was rendered in monochrome, a photograph from which all warmth had been leached. Its skin was the pale white of a cave-dwelling creature. Its eyes were pits of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the scant light. It did not breathe. It did not blink. It was a statue of ice and shadow, and it radiated a silence so profound it felt like a physical force, pushing against Adrian's eardrums, against his mind, against his soul. This was the quantum shadow, the echo of his own ambition, the warden of this silent world. Adrian's breath plumed in the frigid air, the only cloud in the sterile basin. He took a step forward, his heart a frantic, trapped bird against his ribs. The shadow mirrored his movement, a perfect, fluid synchronization that was more unnerving than any hostile gesture. It was not confronting him, it was reflecting him. This was not a battle of strength, but of identity. The shadow's voice, when it came, was not a sound that traveled through the air, but a statement that appeared fully formed inside Adrian's consciousness. It was his own internal monologue, his scientific assessments, stripped of all emotion and played back to him with chilling finality. Conclusion: anomalous presence destabilizes stasis parameters. The variable Adrian Vale introduces entropy. Correction is necessary, return to zero. The assault was psychological, a scalpel dissecting his resolve. It showed him images, not as visions, but as certainties. He saw his own world, 2095, not as a pinnacle of achievement, but as a screaming, chaotic cancer of unchecked growth and consumption, a logical endpoint of the innovation the shadow existed to prevent. It presented Lyra's tribe not as prisoners, but as a perfectly balanced, sustainable system, a masterpiece of managed equilibrium. His guilt was its weapon, and it wielded it with surgical precision, trying to convince him that his sacrifice would be not a liberation, but a further sin against cosmic order. Adrian felt the cold certainty of the entity's logic seeping into him, its sterile worldview a seductive alternative to the messy, painful responsibility of choice. His knees felt weak. The plan, the ritual, his purpose, it all began to crumble under the weight of the shadow's impeccable, emotionless reasoning. Then Lyra stepped past him. She did not look at the pale, monstrous echo of the man beside her. She walked directly toward it, her head held high, her dark eyes fixed not on its void-like gaze, but on the space it occupied, as if she could see the chains that bound it to this world. She did not speak, she simply stood before it, and she opened herself. Adrian could feel it, a wave of pure, undiluted empathy radiating from her. It was not an attack, but an offering. She projected the memory of the tribe's laughter around the fire, the fierce protectiveness of a mother for her child, the awe in a young hunter's eyes when he first successfully tracked a beast, the quiet, profound connection she and Adrian had forged under the stars. She projected the joy of discovery she had felt with the lever, the bittersweet ache of longing for a wider universe, the raw, beautiful, chaotic mess of human feeling. The shadow, a creature of pure logic and stasis, had no defense against this. The empathic wave did not damage it, but it confused its perfect calculations. The sterile basin seemed to flicker. For a fraction of a second, the gray ground showed a hint of green, the leaden sky a flash of blue. The shadow's form wavered, its edges blurring. The cold, internal voice in Adrian's mind stuttered, the relentless stream of logic fragmenting. Emotional data inefficient, unquantifiable, it was a system error. Lyra humanity, her capacity for love and hope and grief, was a virus in its code, a variable. It could not process. Her empathy was not a shield for Adrian. It was a key, jamming the lock of the shadow's absolute control, weakening its hold on the reality it commanded. The echo faltered, and in that momentary lapse, Adrian found the crack in its armor, the sliver of doubt he needed to remember who he was and what he had to do. The shadow's momentary flicker was all the opening Adrian needed. The cold, sterile logic that had threatened to overwhelm him shattered, replaced by a final, crystalline certainty. This was not a battle to be won, but a paradox to be resolved. The shadow was not an enemy to be fought, it was a part of him, a self-sustaining equation that needed to be balanced to zero. He met Lyra's eyes across the cold stone circle, and in that single, profound glance he conveyed everything: gratitude, love, and the finality of his choice. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, her own resolve a beacon in the encroaching gloom. Her work was done. She had weakened the entity's grip with the one weapon it could not comprehend. Now he would deliver the final, clinical blow. He stepped forward, moving past her and into the center of the stone ring, directly toward the pale, waiting echo. The air grew colder, the silence deepening until it was a physical pressure, a weight that threatened to crush thought itself. He ignored the shadow's renewed attempts to speak inside his mind, the cold recitations of probability and entropy. He closed his eyes, shutting out the distorted world, and turned his focus inward. He reached back into the heart of his knowledge, to the quantum principles that had birthed this catastrophe. He visualized the ritual not as magic, but as mathematics, a precise, elegant manipulation of the local field. He began to move his hands, tracing complex, invisible patterns in the air, his fingers drawing the symbols of coherence and collapse, of entanglement and annihilation. He was not casting a spell, he was writing a self-destruct code into the fabric of reality, using his own consciousness as the pen. The shadow, sensing the shift, began to resist. It did not lash out, but pulled. A terrible, irresistible gravity emanated from its form, drawing Adrian toward it. The space between them warped, the gray stones of the circle seeming to stretch and bend. Adrian did not fight the pull. He embraced it, stepping into the heart of the distortion. As he moved closer, the boundary between them began to blur. The shadow's pale form lost its solidity, becoming a vortex of swirling darkness and cold light. Adrian felt a terrifying dissolution, a sense of his own self unraveling at the seams. His memories, his thoughts, his very sense of identity began to bleed away, siphoned into the hungry void of the echo. He was not being consumed, he was merging, his consciousness flowing into the shadow, filling the emptiness at its core with the very humanity it had been created to suppress. The world around him, the stone circle, the twisted mountains, the washed-out sky, began to flicker and fade, not into darkness, but into a blinding white nothingness. He felt his existence stretching thin, fraying across countless dimensions, a single note of consciousness dissolving into the silent chord of the cosmos. The weight of his body, the ache of his muscles, the chill of the air, it all vanished, replaced by a vast, expanding emptiness. He was a ghost in the machine of reality, and the machine was rebooting. This was the end. The anchor was being pulled, the paradox resolving itself in a wave of recursive silence. In the last moment before the final dissolution, as the white nothingness threatened to claim everything, a single point of color and warmth pierced the void. He turned his fading awareness toward it. There was Lyra, standing at the edge of the vanishing world, her figure solid and real amidst the unraveling chaos. Tears streamed freely down her face, tracing glistening paths through the dust on her skin. But her lips were not set in a grimace of grief. They were curved into a soft, radiant smile, a smile filled with an impossible mixture of heartbreak and hope, of farewell and gratitude. Her eyes, dark and deep, held his vanishing form, and in them he saw not the end of his story, but the brilliant, dawning beginning of hers. It was the last thing he saw, the final, beautiful contradiction imprinted on his soul, a tearful smile, a silent thank you, a promise of a world awakening. And then Adrian Vale was gone. The silence that followed was not the cold, sterile silence of the shadow, but a profound and startling quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The blinding white nothingness that had consumed Adrian contracted, then vanished with a soft, final sigh, like a candle extinguished in a vast, dark room. The oppressive cold that had gripped the stone circle for generations simply evaporated, replaced by the clean, thin chill of the mountain air. The warped, bleeding colors of the landscape bled back into their proper hues. The gray stones became dark granite, the jaundiced sky resolved into a clear, pale blue, and the twisted trees seemed to sigh and relax, their branches untwisting as if released from a terrible, unseen tension. Lyra stood alone in the center of the circle, the echo of Adrian's final smile still burning in her vision. The space where he and the shadow had merged and dissolved was empty, holding only the memory of his sacrifice. A profound absence settled in her chest, a hollow ache that was both a wound and a liberation. He was gone, truly and completely erased, not just from this place, but from the very weave of possibility. The weight of his absence was a physical pressure, a vast and silent space where his presence had been. Yet within that hollow, she felt something new stirring. It was a sense of lightness, of a great, suffocating weight being lifted from the world, from the air, from her own mind. The constant, low-level hum of dread that had been the background of her entire life was gone. The great silence was over. Back in the village, the shift was immediate and visceral. A hunter in the middle of chipping a flint suddenly saw a new, more efficient angle for his strike, and the resulting blade was sharper and finer than any he had ever made. A woman weaving a basket, her hands moving by rote, paused, her eyes widening as a new, stronger pattern unfolded in her mind's eye. Children who had only ever mimicked their elders' games began building small, complex structures of sticks and stones, their play suddenly infused with a strange, inventive logic. A low murmur of excited conversation began to ripple through the tribe, not the fearful whispers of before, but the vibrant, chaotic buzz of new ideas being born. The mental fog that had clouded their thoughts for centuries had lifted, and in its place was a dazzling, terrifying, and exhilarating clarity. Lyra felt the change flowing through her with the force of a spring river. The grief for Adrian was a deep, still pool within her, but it was not a stagnant one. It was fed by a new, rushing current of understanding. Concepts that had been vague intuitions now snapped into sharp focus. The principles of the lever, once a brilliant flash, now connected to a dozen other ideas: the wheel, the pulley, the inclined plane. She looked at the world and saw not just what it was, but what it could be. The suppression was gone. The warden was gone. The prison door was open, and she was standing on the threshold, breathing the free air for the first time. The emptiness Adrian left behind was not a void. It was a space he had carved out for her, for all of them to fill with their own voices, their own songs, their own future. She felt his absence keenly, a permanent scar on her heart, but layered over it was a profound, soaring sense of freedom, the freedom to think, to build, to become. The silence that had defined her people was gone, replaced by a vibrant, sometimes chaotic, symphony of thought. In the days and weeks that followed the great unshackling, the village was no longer a place of quiet routine, but a living workshop of the mind. Lyra, her heart a vessel of both profound sorrow and soaring purpose, moved through this new world as its natural leader. The tribe's gaze, once wary or pitying, now rested upon her with a mixture of awe and expectation. She was the one who had faced the heart of the silence and returned, not with a curse, but with a key. She guided them not with commands, but with demonstrations, her hands giving form to the concepts that now bloomed like wildflowers in the cleared field of their consciousness. The simple lever became the foundation for a new understanding. She showed them how to use a long pole and a fulcrum to lift the heavy logs for new huts, saving days of backbreaking labor. She guided their hands in lashing sharpened stones to longer handles, creating axes that could fell trees with startling efficiency and adzes that could smooth wood into planks. They built their first crude cart, a platform of lashed branches set on 2 rounds cut from a thick log. The sight of it rolling, bearing a load that would have required 4 strong hunters to carry, sent a ripple of astonished laughter through the tribe. It was not magic, it was a principle, a truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Lyra's own mind, once a bright flame in a dense fog, now blazed with an unchecked intensity. She remembered Adrian not with the paralyzing grief of loss, but with a bittersweet gratitude that fueled her every action. His absence was a constant, quiet companion, but his legacy was the very air she breathed. In the quiet moments before dawn, she would feel the ghost of his hand on hers, guiding her through the fire-making ritual, and the memory would spark a new idea, a way to channel smoke out of a hut, a new knot that held stronger under strain, a method for predicting the weather by the behavior of the insects. His sacrifice had not just freed their world from the shadow, it had fully unleashed her own formidable intelligence, a fusion of her innate connection to the land and the seeds of analytical thought he had left behind. She began to explore the once forbidden concepts with a fearless curiosity. She experimented with clay from the riverbank, discovering that different types hardened at different temperatures in the fire, leading to the first attempts at pottery. She observed how a stretched animal skin, when struck, produced a sound, and she began experimenting with tension and size, guiding the creation of the tribe's first drums, instruments that gave rhythm to their newfound voices. She even dared to look again at the anachronistic artifacts, the rusted pieces of Adrian's world. She did not see them as spirit-touched objects of fear, but as puzzles. She studied the broken quantum device, tracing the interlocking circles with her finger, not understanding their meaning, but understanding that they represented a system, a logic far beyond her own. It was a goal, a distant star to steer by. Under her guidance, the tribe was no longer merely surviving within their world. They were beginning to converse with it, to ask it questions, and to build the tools to understand its answers. Lyra's new world was one of relentless, beautiful, and terrifying potential, and she stood at its center, the architect of a dawn she and a man from another reality had paid everything to see. The legacy of a sacrifice was not etched in stone or sung in heroic ballads. It was woven into the very texture of daily life, a silent resonance in every lifted weight, every turned wheel, every new idea that bloomed where only silence had grown before. For Lyra, Adrian's absence was a permanent chamber of her heart, a space of quiet sorrow she visited in the still moments of dawn and dusk. But that chamber was no longer a tomb. It had become a forge, and from its fires emerged not grief, but a steely, purposeful gratitude. She felt his legacy not as a ghost from the past, but as a living presence in the hum of progress that now animated her people. In the smooth glide of the new potter's wheel she had helped design, she felt his patient hands guiding hers. In the triumphant shout of a hunter who had perfected the new, more powerful bow, she heard the echo of his belief in their potential. He was in the clean lines of the new, larger huts, in the intricate patterns of the stronger baskets, in the curious, unafraid eyes of the children as they played with toys of their own invention. His sacrifice was the fertile ground from which their new world was sprouting, and every innovation was a flower laid upon his unmarked grave. This burgeoning progress demanded a new kind of memory, one that was not subject to the frailties of oral tradition or the distortions of time. The stories of the echoing age and the great silence, once cautionary myths, were now a history to be understood, a warning to be heeded. Lyra watched as an elder, his gnarled fingers tracing a new symbol for waterwheel in the soft earth, only to see the morning rain wash it away. The frustration on his face was a mirror of a deeper problem. Knowledge, once a flickering flame passed from one generation to the next, needed a vessel that could hold it against the elements, against forgetfulness. The idea came to her not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, dawning certainty, another echo of Adrian's world-thinking mind. She gathered the tribe by the central fire, now a symbol of warmth and community rather than a fragile defense against the dark. She did not speak of gods or spirits. She spoke of the lever, of the cart, of the water wheel. She spoke of the need to hold these truths safe, to build a memory that was stronger than any one person. Then she took a sharpened piece of charcoal from the fire's edge, and a broad, flat section of bark she had prepared. With deliberate, careful strokes she began to draw. She drew the sun tan, and next to it the symbol for the sundial they had begun to use. She drew water, Maraeth, and next to it the schematic for the irrigation channel they were planning. She was not writing words, but creating a lexicon of ideas, a bridge between their old language and their new understanding. A hush fell over the tribe, deeper than any imposed by fear. This was a different kind of magic, more profound than moving mountains. This was the capturing of a thought, the giving of form to an idea so it could travel through time. One by one, others came forward. A hunter drew the anatomy of the great cat, marking the location of its heart. A weaver sketched the new, stronger knot pattern. A child hesitantly drew a stick figure looking up at a sky filled with strange, wonderful shapes. It was clumsy, it was primitive, but it was a beginning. It was the first, trembling step out of the eternal present and into the stream of history. This act of documentation was more than practicality. It was the ultimate symbol of their evolution, a declaration that they would never again allow their knowledge to be stolen by a great silence. They were building an ark for their collective mind, and in every charcoal line, in every carved symbol, Lyra felt the quiet, approving presence of the man who had taught them that a shadow, no matter how vast, could be banished by the stubborn, enduring light of a single, documented idea. The stars were no longer just distant, cold points of light. To Lyra, gazing up from the same clearing where a man from another world had once sat beside her, they were now a vibrant, humming tapestry of possibility. The oppressive silence that had once clung to the heavens was gone, replaced by a profound and resonant quiet, the kind that exists not in the absence of sound, but in the space between notes of a great, unfolding symphony. She felt the universe not as a closed, silent dome, but as an infinite, expanding frontier. And in that vast, breathing darkness, she sensed a familiar presence, not a ghost, not a memory, but an echo woven into the very fabric of existence. Adrian was not in the wind or the trees. He was in the expansion itself, in the relentless, beautiful push of creation into the void. His sacrifice had not been an end, but a catalyst, a single, resonant note that had set the cosmos to vibrating on a new frequency, and this world was its loudest, most joyful chord. Below her, the village was a constellation of its own, its fires glowing like captured starlight. The sounds that drifted up were not the hushed tones of a fearful people, but the vibrant cacophony of a civilization discovering its voice, the rhythmic tap of a mallet shaping wood, the low murmur of intense discussion, the clear, confident laughter of children. The tribe was no longer merely a part of the landscape. They were in conversation with it, their new tools and Structure's a language of questions and answers. The first water wheel turned steadily in the stream, its purpose a silent poem to the principle Adrian had died to set free. Every innovation, every spark of understanding was a testament to his choice, and Lyra felt the emotional resonance of his sacrifice not as a fading sorrow, but as a permanent, strengthening force within her, the bedrock upon which their new era was being built. As the first hint of dawn tinged the eastern sky with a soft, rose-gold light, she turned from the stars and walked back to the heart of the village. The central clearing was no longer just a fire pit, but a place of gathering and record. A smooth, flat stone had been placed there, a permanent slate for their collective mind. As the sun's first rays broke over the horizon, a young girl, her face alight with the unshadowed curiosity of her generation, knelt before it. In her hand, she held a sharpened piece of flint, with a concentration that mirrored Lyra's. When she had first lifted the impossible stone, the girl began to scratch a series of marks onto the stone's surface. They were not just pictures. They were stylized, simplified representations of their core concepts: a sun, a hand, a flowing river, a lever. It was crude, it was nascent, but it was undeniably writing, the tribe's first written words. The story of their world did not end with a battle or a coronation, but with this quiet, monumental act. It ended with the poignant resonance of a love that had bridged dimensions, a sacrifice that had shattered chains, and a hope that was now etching itself indelibly into stone. The great silence had been replaced by the soft, sure scratch of a flint point, a sound more powerful than any thunder. It was the sound of a world once held in a perpetual, dreaming infancy, finally taking its first conscious, documented breath. The dawn was not just in the sky. It was in the girl's determined eyes, in the marks on the stone, in the very air. They breathed. A new era was not coming, it was here, written in the language of a world finally, fully awakening.